At exactly 7:42 p.m. on December 23rd, while 17 relatives stood in my parents' living room, holding crystal glasses of sparkling cider, my father slid a sealed envelope across the mahogany coffee table and said, "You're not in the will anymore, Olivia." He didn't blink, he didn't hesitate, and he didn't expect me to smile. If you've ever been excluded from your own family like you were a clerical error, subscribe. Because what happened next didn't destroy me. It built something they never saw coming. But before I tell you why I was removed from the inheritance 3 days before Christmas, you need to understand the kind of family I was born into. My name is Olivia Bennett. I'm 32 years old. I live in Charleston, South Carolina. And until that night, I believed loyalty meant silence. My father, Richard Bennett, built Bennett Marine Supply from a 2-boat repair shop into a regional distribution company, valued at roughly $18.6 million. Not public. Privately held. Clean books. Strong vendor contracts up and down the East Coast. My mother, Patricia Bennett, managed appearances, charity boards, church committees. The kind of woman who weaponized kindness like a scalpel. And then there was my older sister, Caroline Bennett Hayes. Golden child. Polished. Married at 28 to a real estate developer named Thomas Hayes. 3 children before 31. The kind of woman my parents described as stable. I was the unstable one. Because I didn't marry, because I didn't stay in Charleston, because I earned a law degree at Duke and specialized in corporate compliance in Atlanta instead of coming home to help the family, because I asked questions. That night, the house smelled like cinnamon candles and pine needles. Christmas music played softly from hidden speakers. Everything looked curated, controlled. The envelope was cream-colored, heavy stock paper. I didn't open it. "I assume this is a revised will," I asked. My father folded his hands. "It's a formal notice. As of this morning, the majority stake in Bennett Marine Supply transfers to Caroline upon my retirement." Retirement. He was 63. He'd shown no signs of stepping back. And my share, I asked. There isn't one. 17 relatives. Not one sound. My cousin Daniel stared at the carpet. My Aunt Margaret sipped her cider. No one defended me. Caroline reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "It's just business, Liv," she whispered. "You chose your own path. Business." That word lingered, because this wasn't emotional. This was strategic. Here's what they didn't know: I understand contracts better than they understand loyalty. I leaned back into the sofa and crossed my legs. "May I ask when the new documents were drafted?" I said calmly. My father's jaw tightened slightly. "Last week." "Interesting. South Carolina probate law requires clear capacity and voluntary execution for amendments. My father had been hospitalized in November for atrial fibrillation. Temporary cognitive fog is common with that medication combination. I wasn't surprised I was removed. I was surprised at the timing. 3 days before Christmas. Public setting. Witnesses. Why announce it like that? Why not tell me privately? Unless this wasn't just about money. It was about humiliation. Let me pause here. If you were sitting in that room surrounded by your parents, your sister, your entire extended family, and you were just erased financially in front of all of them, would you argue? Would you cry? Or would you stay silent? Tell me what you'd do. I'm genuinely curious. Because I chose silence. And silence unsettles people more than tears ever could. "I see," I said simply. My mother exhaled, almost relieved that I wasn't causing a scene. "You'll always be our daughter," she added gently. "This just reflects commitment." Commitment. Another word carefully chosen. Caroline looked almost anxious. Not triumphant. Anxious. And that was the first crack in the glass. Because if this were truly clean, she'd be glowing. Instead, her fingers were trembling. Dinner resumed. Ham, sweet potatoes, rolls. Laughter slowly returned. But I noticed something else. My father avoided eye contact with me for the rest of the night. Not anger. Avoidance. There's a difference. At 9:18 p.m., I stepped outside onto the back porch. The air was cold and sharp. I pulled out my phone and emailed myself a simple note. 12/23. Public disinheritance announcement. Witness count 17. Emotional pressure environment. Documentation matters. Always. Caroline joined me 5 minutes later. "You're not upset?" she asked quietly. "Should I be?" She wrapped her arms around herself. "It just makes sense. You're not here. I've been working with Dad for years." That stopped me. "You've been working with Dad?" I asked. She hesitated. "Too long. Just helping. Informally." "Helping? informally. Bennett Marine Supply had regulatory exposure, vendor compliance contracts, maritime insurance layers, multi-state distribution tax obligations. No one helps informally with that scale of business. Not without authority, not without documentation, not without liability, unless paperwork already existed. Tier 1 of truth I had been removed, but Tier 2, there were documents I hadn't seen, and I had a feeling they weren't as airtight as my father believed. "I'm happy for you," I said finally. She studied my face, searching for sarcasm. There wasn't any. That unsettled her more. Back inside, my mother was refilling glasses. My father stood near the fireplace, staring into it like a man calculating something. When I hugged him goodbye, I whispered, I hope everything was signed correctly. His body went rigid, just for a second. Then he smiled. Of course it was. But here's the thing about men who've run companies for 40 years. They're used to control. They're not used to their daughter understanding leverage. As I drove back to my hotel that night, I replayed every detail. The announcement, the witnesses, Caroline's trembling hands, my father's hospital stay, and one sentence echoed louder than the rest. You chose your own path. Yes, I did, and they had just chosen theirs. What they didn't realize yet was that inheritance isn't just about who receives money. It's about who assumes responsibility. And if Caroline had been quietly inserted into corporate control, then she had also quietly inherited exposure. Regulatory exposure, tax exposure, contractual exposure, personal liability. I didn't sleep much that night. At 2:11 a.m., I pulled up the South Carolina Secretary of State's business filings database. And that's when I saw it. An amendment filed 8 days earlier. Authorized signatory Caroline Bennett Hayes. There was only one problem. She wasn't listed as an officer before that date. So who authorized her, and under what authority? That question would change everything. Because if the paperwork wasn't clean, then neither was the transfer. And I had no intention of fighting for an inheritance. I was going to wait. And let the law do what karma always promises. Turn the tables. If you think revenge is loud, you haven't seen it done quietly. At exactly 9:03 a.m. on December 27th, I walked into Roper St. Francis Hospital and requested my father's admission records from November 14th. Not as a daughter, as an attorney. If you've ever suspected that something felt off but couldn't prove it, stay with me. Because the next detail is where family drama turns into documented betrayal. The receptionist asked for identification. I handed over my Georgia bar card and a notarized HIPAA authorization form. Yes, I already had one. 2 years ago, after my father's first cardiac scare, he insisted both Caroline Bennett Hayes and I be listed as medical proxies in case anything happened. He trusted us equally then, or at least that's what he said. By 9:41 a.m., I was seated in a quiet records room with a temporary access login and a stack of electronic files. Admission November 14th, 8:22 p.m. diagnosis atrial, fibrillation with rapid ventricular response, medication diltiazem drip, sedation administered lorazepam 1 milligram at 10:07 p.m. I closed my eyes briefly. Lorazepam. Mild cognitive impairment is common within hours of administration, especially in patients over 60. At 10:54 p.m., according to the chart, my father was described as drowsy but responsive. At 11:32 p.m., nurse notation patient intermittently confused regarding date. And then I saw it. 11:48 p.m., family member present. Documentation reviewed. Family member not specified. I checked the visitor log. Caroline Bennett Hayes signed in at 10:41 p.m. She was the only family member recorded that night. My father's will amendment was notarized November 15th at 9:12 a.m. Less than 10 hours later. Let that sit for a moment. He was confused at 11:32 p.m. Documents reviewed at 11:48 p.m. And by the next morning, legal changes were executed. If you were in my position, what would you think? Coincidence, efficiency, or opportunity? I didn't jump to conclusions. I've built my career on compliance investigations, emotion cloud strategy. But here's what I knew. Under South Carolina law, testamentary capacity requires that the individual understands the nature and extent of their property and the consequences of their actions. Confusion documented hours before execution doesn't automatically invalidate a will, but it creates questions. And questions create leverage. Tier 1 of the hidden truth I was removed. Tier 2 was emerging timing under sedation, but there was still a deeper layer. Who arranged the notary? The amendment listed a mobile notary named Harold Simmons. Commission verified. Valid. Address in Mount Pleasant. I searched his business page. Reviews. 5-star rating, mostly estate documents and real estate closings. I called him at 10:17 a.m. He answered on the second ring. Harold Simmons. Mr. Simmons, this is Olivia Bennett. You notarized a will amendment for Richard Bennett on November 15th. Silence. Then professional caution. Yes, ma'am. Can you confirm where that signing took place? I'm not at liberty to discuss client matters. Of course, I said evenly. I'm listed as prior beneficiary and medical proxy. I'm simply verifying location for my records. Another pause. Residence, he said finally. At Mr. Bennett's home. Not the hospital. The house. So he was discharged first. I checked discharge time. November 15th, 7:58 a.m. Released against medical advice. Against medical advice. That phrase is heavy. It means the physician recommended continued observation. He left anyway. Why? Because someone needed him home before 9:12 a.m. I thanked Harold politely and ended the call. Then I drove past my parents' house. 2-story colonial. Perfect lawn. American flag in front. It looked unchanged. But I imagined the scene 12 days earlier. Caroline bringing him home. Medication still in his bloodstream. Mobile notary arriving. Documents prepared. Sign here, Dad. It's just housekeeping. Sign here. Sign here. And maybe he understood. Maybe he didn't. That uncertainty is a crack in concrete. And cracks widen. Around noon, Caroline texted me. Lunch before you go back to Atlanta. Interesting timing. I agreed. We met at a waterfront cafe downtown. She wore a cream sweater and pearl earrings. Calm, controlled. I heard you stopped by the hospital, she said, stirring her tea. I wanted clarity. Her jaw tightened slightly. It was Dad's decision. I'm sure that's what you believe. She leaned forward. Olivia, you left. You built your own life. I stayed. I handled vendor disputes. I renegotiated 2 supply contracts last year. I've been working inside the company for 18 months. There it was again. Working inside. Under what title, I asked. She hesitated. Advisor. Advisors don't file corporate amendments. Her face went pale, so she didn't know I'd already checked the Secretary of State filings. On December 15th, an amendment added her as Vice President of Operations, effective November 16th, one day after the will change. Backdated corporate authority layered on top of estate transfer. Clean on paper. Unless the capacity at signing is challenged. Unless the board approval process wasn't followed correctly. Bennett Marine Supply has 3 voting members. My father, my mother, and until recently, me. Because I still held 15% non-voting shares issued when I was 25 as part of a tax restructuring strategy. Non-voting, but documented ownership. And corporate bylaws require shareholder notice of officer appointments within 10 business days. I never received one. Let me ask you something. If your own sister quietly inserted herself into corporate power while you were working 12-hour days in another state, would you confront her immediately, or would you gather more evidence? I chose patience. Caroline, I said softly, do you understand fiduciary duty? She frowned. Of course. It means you owe loyalty and care to all shareholders. Not just Dad. A flicker of doubt crossed her eyes. You're not going to sue our parents, she said. Not a question. A fear. I haven't decided what I'm going to do. And that was true, because this wasn't about revenge yet. It was about information. Tier 3 of the hidden truth was still buried, and I suspected it involved more than just a will. When we stood to leave, she grabbed my arm. Don't blow up the family over money. I looked at her steadily. This stopped being about money when you chose secrecy. That line lingered between us. You didn't protect the family. You protected your advantage. I didn't say it out loud. Not yet. That night, back in my hotel room, I logged into the IRS exempt organizations database. Bennett Marine Supply had a related entity, Bennett Coastal Relief Foundation, a charitable foundation my mother chaired, and Caroline had been added as co-director. November 20th. 5 days after the will change, control wasn't just shifting. It was consolidating. When power moves that quickly, it's rarely defensive. It's preparatory. The question wasn't whether they removed me. The question was what they were preparing for. And at 11:38 p.m., an email notification arrived in my inbox. Subject line urgent. Vendor compliance review. Sent to Caroline at bennettmarine.com. Accidentally CC'd to my old company email address. I opened it, and what I read made my pulse slow instead of race. Because panic is loud. Strategy is quiet. There was a pending federal audit, and Caroline had just signed off as acting vice president, without proper board ratification, which meant personal liability. which meant exposure, which meant the tables weren't just turning, they were already shifting. At 6:12 a.m. on December 29th, I reread the federal audit notice while the rest of Charleston was still asleep. Subject line: Notice of Compliance Examination, U.S. Customs and Border Protection. If you've never seen a CBP audit letter tied to maritime imports, let me simplify it. It's not casual, it's not routine, and it's never harmless. The notice referenced 3 shipments flagged under the Lacey Act Compliance Review, a federal law regulating imported wood products and protected materials. Bennett Marine Supply distributes treated marine lumber and specialty dock components. Most of it is domestic, but some resin-treated teak planks came from overseas vendors, specifically Indonesia. The audit date was scheduled for January 18th, less than 3 weeks away, and the signatory listed on the vendor compliance certification, Caroline Bennett Hayes, Acting Vice President of Operations. Effective November 16th, one day after the will amendment. I leaned back in my chair and let the silence stretch. This wasn't small. Under federal import law, certifying compliance without proper due diligence can result in civil penalties up to $10,000 per violation, sometimes more depending on valuation, and in certain cases, criminal exposure. Now pause for a second. Imagine being inserted into executive authority of an $18 million company, and within weeks your name is attached to a federal compliance audit. Would you feel empowered or set up? Because here's the thing. My father handled vendor certification personally for years. He never delegated final sign-off. Until suddenly, he did. Why give Caroline authority just before an audit? Why consolidate estate control right before potential regulatory scrutiny? Unless this wasn't about rewarding her. Unless it was about insulating someone else. Tier 1, I was removed from the will. Tier 2, timing under sedation. Tier 3 was emerging liability transfer. And that layer was dangerous. At 8:04 a.m., my phone rang. It was Thomas Hayes, Caroline's husband. Real estate developer. Controlled smile. Polished handshake. "Olivia," he said smoothly. "Heard you're digging around?" "I review documents," I replied. "Family matters should stay family. Federal audits aren't family matters." Silence. Then carefully, "Caroline is capable." "I'm sure she is." Another pause. "You're not planning to interfere with operations, are you?" There it was. Fear disguised as diplomacy. "I still hold equity," I said calmly. "Interference isn't required. Oversight is." His tone hardened slightly. "Don't make this adversarial." Adversarial. Interesting word. Because no one had mentioned the audit to me. Not my father. Not my mother. Not Caroline. They publicly disinherited me 3 days before Christmas, while quietly stepping into a federal compliance review. That's not coincidence. That's choreography. After we hung up, I forwarded the audit notice to my secure work email. Then I reviewed the corporate bylaws of Bennett Marine Supply, Section 4.2, Appointment of Officers. Any appointment of vice president level authority requires written majority approval of voting shareholders. Voting shareholders: Richard Bennett, 55% Patricia Bennett, 30% Olivia Bennett, 15%. I checked my records. No written notice, no consent form, no digital vote request, which meant one of 2 things. Either they forged procedural compliance, or they ignored it. Both create exposure. Around noon, my father finally called. His voice sounded measured. "You've been asking questions." "I've been reading filings." "This is unnecessary." "For whom?" A long breath on the other end. "You don't understand the full picture." "Then explain it." He hesitated. And in that hesitation was something I hadn't expected. Not anger, not arrogance. Concern. "The audit is routine," he said finally. "Then why restructure executive authority days before it?" Silence. "You always assume the worst," he said. "No," I replied quietly. "I assume there's a reason." He lowered his voice. "I'm protecting this family." That sentence landed heavier than anything else. Because protection can mean 2 very different things. You can protect someone from harm, or you can protect yourself from consequences. From what I asked, he didn't answer. Instead, he said something that felt rehearsed. "Caroline needs to prove herself. By signing federal compliance documents, that's not a training exercise. That's liability exposure. Let me ask you something. If your father transferred corporate authority to your sister right before an audit, would you believe it was about mentorship or insulation?" I ended the call with more questions than answers, so I did what I do best. I followed the money. The CBP notice referenced 3 shipments from PT Sonar Loud Exports. I searched import manifests. The declared value on one shipment was $1.2 million. But the bill of lading showed a discrepancy in weight compared to invoice records. That's a red flag. Not proof of wrongdoing, but enough to trigger deeper scrutiny. If undervaluation occurred to reduce import duties, that's federal territory. And whoever signs compliant certifications assumes responsibility for accuracy. Caroline's name was on 2 of the 3 certifications, dated November 22nd and December 3rd, which means she stepped into authority fast. Too fast. I drove to the marina that afternoon. Bennett Marine's warehouse sat along the Cooper River, corrugated metal exterior forklifts humming inside. I parked across the street and watched for 15 minutes. Employees moved normally, no visible panic. But audits don't announce themselves to staff immediately. They start at the top, and I knew something Caroline didn't. Under 19 U.S.C. Section 1592, negligent violations can still trigger substantial penalties, and corporate officers who certify false information can be personally liable if knowledge or reckless disregard is proven. Knowledge. That word matters. Did she know everything she signed, or did she trust someone else's preparation? Because if she relied entirely on Dad's assurances, then she wasn't empowered. She was exposed. At 4:37 p.m., I received another email, this one addressed directly to me. From internal compliance at bennettmarine.com, subject shareholder notification. Pending review. That was interesting, because now they were acknowledging my shareholder status. The attachment was a draft resolution, dated December 30th, requesting retroactive approval of Caroline's appointment as vice president. Retroactive. After filings already made. After audit notice received. That's not procedure. That's cleanup. And cleanup happens when someone realizes a corner was cut. I smiled for the first time since December 23rd. Not out of cruelty. Out of clarity. They weren't confident. They were scrambling. That night, Caroline texted me again. Can we talk tomorrow, just us? I replied, of course. Because here's what she still didn't understand. I wasn't preparing to attack. I was preparing to wait. Revenge isn't explosive. It's architectural, and the structure they were building had a load-bearing flaw. What Caroline didn't know yet was that the 3rd shipment listed in the audit notice was approved the morning after Dad signed the amended will, while he was still adjusting medication. And that shipment contained something misclassified under customs code. Something small, but expensive, and potentially criminal. At 8:26 a.m. on January 2nd, I walked into Bennett Marine Supply's main warehouse, wearing a navy wool coat and the calm expression of someone who already knew more than she was supposed to. No one stopped me. My access badge still worked. That alone told me something. If I were truly excluded, operational access would have been revoked immediately. Instead, I was still on the internal system, still a shareholder, still inconvenient. The warehouse smelled like treated lumber and diesel fuel. Forklifts moved slowly between stacked pallets. Men in reflective vests nodded politely as I passed. Routine. Normal. That's the illusion companies rely on. In the office overlooking the loading bay, I found Martin Lopez, operations manager. 48. Efficient. Loyal to my father for nearly 15 years. Olivia, he said carefully. Didn't know you were in town. I needed to review shipment documentation. He hesitated. Is this about the audit? So they did know. How many people are aware, I asked. Just executive level. Executive level. That meant my father. My mother, Caroline. Not Martin. He looked uneasy. Martin, I said quietly. I need the inventory intake report for shipment. ID 7843L. He blinked. That's the teak consignment. Yes. He pulled up the digital file. Shipment received November 16th, the morning after the will amendment. I scanned the intake sheet. Declared contents, marine-grade teak planks. Quantity 12,000 linear feet. Declared value $1.2 million. But then I noticed an internal notation flagged in yellow. Supplemental crate hold for exec review. Supplemental crate. Not listed on the customs declaration summary. Where is that crate, I asked. Martin shifted. Secured storage. Mr. Bennett said not to inventory it yet. Not to inventory it. That's unusual. Everything entering bonded storage must be logged. Who signed intake, I asked. He turned the screen toward me. Signature Caroline Bennett Hayes. I felt something settle into place. Tier 3 of the truth was no longer theoretical. Can you show me the secured storage area, I asked. Martin hesitated again. Caroline said no one else should access it until after the audit. Caroline doesn't outrank corporate governance, I replied calmly. I do. He studied my face, and for the first time I saw doubt about where authority actually sat. 10 minutes later, we were standing in front of a locked steel cage at the back of the warehouse. Martin unlocked it. Inside sat a crate roughly 4 feet long, 3 feet wide, unmarked except for a shipping code sticker. I crouched beside it. No customs seal. That was the first violation. Every imported crate under active declaration should carry a seal. Did this arrive with the main shipment, I asked? Yes, Martin said. Same container. Was it listed on the bill of lading? He frowned. I don't think so. I stood slowly. Now pause. If you found an unlisted crate attached to $1 million shipment, would you assume oversight or concealment? I didn't assume. I verified. Open it, I said. Martin looked like he wanted to refuse, but he didn't. The lid came off with a metallic scrape. Inside were boxed marine electronics, high-end GPS navigation units, and radar modules. Not teak, not wood products. Electronics. Each box labeled with a separate manufacturer from Taiwan. Declared value per unit approximately $18,000. There were 20 units inside. That's $360,000 retail. Unlisted, undeclared. If imported without proper customs classification and duties, that's not a paperwork mistake. That's smuggling territory. My pulse didn't race. It slowed, because clarity brings control. Who ordered these, I asked. Martin shook his head. I don't know. They weren't on the purchase order summary. I took photos, every angle, every label, every serial number. Then I asked the question that mattered most. Who instructed you not to log it? He swallowed. Mr. Bennett. There it was. Not Caroline. My father. But Caroline signed intake, which means she accepted responsibility for receiving a shipment that included undeclared goods, whether she knew or not. And under federal import law, ignorance isn't always protection. You need to reseal this and log the contents immediately, I said. Caroline said. I don't care what Caroline said. My voice stayed even. Cold. Document chain of custody. Timestamp everything. If this audit escalates, you will need proof you weren't complicit. Martin nodded. Fear had replaced hesitation. When I stepped outside, the January air felt sharper than before. So now we had it. Hidden electronics embedded in a wood shipment. Undeclared. Signed off under Caroline's authority. Received the day after the will change. This wasn't about inheritance. This was about liability shifting. And suddenly, my father's sentence echoed differently. I'm protecting this family. From what? From penalties, from criminal exposure, or from himself. At 2:13 p.m., Caroline called. Her voice sounded strained. You went to the warehouse. Yes. You opened the secured crate. Yes. Long silence. You weren't supposed to. Neither was it. Her breathing quickened. Dad handled that order. I know. Then you understand. Do I? She exhaled sharply. It was temporary storage. The paperwork is coming. That's not how customs law works. Paperwork precedes entry, not the other way around. Caroline, I said quietly, did you know what was inside that crate when you signed intake? Silence. And that silence answered me. No, she whispered finally. There it was. She was an architect. She was shielded, used, inserted into position right before a compliance storm. And if the audit uncovered undeclared electronics attached to a wood shipment under Lacey Act scrutiny, the executive who certified intake would face questions first, not the retired founder. Her. Let me ask you something. If you discovered your parents had positioned your sister as legal insulation, would you expose it immediately? Or would you wait for the perfect moment? Because here's what Caroline didn't know yet. I wasn't going to the authorities. Not yet. I was going to let the audit proceed exactly as scheduled. January 18th. Federal officers. Formal documentation review. And when they asked who certified the shipment, Caroline's name would surface. Publicly. And then we'd see how quickly my father shifted his definition of protection. At 6:40 p.m., I received a text from my mother. Family dinner Sunday. We need unity. Unity. That word almost made me laugh. Unity built on concealment isn't unity. It's choreography. And someone always misses a step. What none of them knew was that I had already contacted an independent maritime compliance consultant in Savannah, off the record, to assess exposure. Because revenge isn't emotional. It's strategic timing, and January 18th was approaching. But there was something else, something buried deeper. While reviewing the import manifest again that night, I noticed a secondary customs broker listed on the electronics manufacturer line. A broker my father had never used before, registered only 3 months ago, and partially owned by a holding company. That holding company's registered agent, Thomas Hayes, Caroline's husband. At exactly 7:18 a.m. on January 4th, I printed the incorporation documents for Atlantic Harbor Logistics, LLC. Registered 3 months ago. Delaware filing. Foreign entity authorization in South Carolina. Dated October 12th. Registered agent Thomas Edward Hayes. If you've ever watched someone build a safety net beneath themselves while pretending to stand beside you, you'll recognize the feeling I had in that moment. Not rage. Recognition. Because Atlantic Harbor Logistics wasn't just a customs broker intermediary. It was positioned between the overseas electronics supplier and Bennett Marine Supply, which meant one thing: margin capture. Let me explain in simple terms. If Bennett Marine imported electronics directly at cost-profit margins, would sit inside the company. But if a related third-party broker purchased the goods, first marked them up, and resold to Bennett Marine, the profit moves. Quietly, legally complex, but strategically powerful, especially if someone anticipated regulatory scrutiny. I cross-referenced invoices attached to shipment 7843L. There it was. Seller of record Atlantic Harbor Logistics. Declared value per GPS unit $11,200. Retail market value $18,000, which means Atlantic Harbor purchased lower, sold higher. Margin difference per unit approximately $2,800. 20 units, $56,000 in profit. One shipment. Now ask yourself, if you were Thomas Hayes, married to the newly appointed Vice President of Operations, and you controlled the intermediary broker, would you disclose that relationship clearly to all shareholders, or would you assume no one would look? Because corporate conflict of interest disclosure isn't optional, it's mandatory, and I had never received notice of any related party transaction, which meant one of two things. Either Caroline didn't know her husband was involved, or she did. At 8:02 a.m. I called Thomas. He answered immediately. "You've been busy," he said. "So have you." Silence. "You looked up Atlantic Harbor?" "Yes. It's a separate entity, owned by you. It's a logistics facilitator for your wife's company." Pause. "It's not illegal." "No," I said calmly. "Not inherently. Related party transactions are permissible under U.S. corporate law provided they are disclosed and approved by disinterested shareholders." Which I was, and I was never informed. "Did Caroline approve the broker contract?" I asked. "She signed the purchase authorization, knowing you owned the broker." He didn't answer directly. "She trusts me." Trust. There's that word again. "You didn't protect the family," I said quietly. "You protected your margin." He exhaled sharply. "You're overreacting." "Am I?" Let's pause here. If you discovered your sister unknowingly signed a compliance certification tied to her husband's undisclosed broker, would you confront her immediately, or would you let the conflict surface publicly? Because once federal auditors trace financial flow, they look for related party disclosures. And if those are missing, questions multiply fast. After the call, I reviewed Bennett Marine's corporate bylaws again. Section 7.4, Conflict of Interest. Any transaction involving an officer or immediate family member must be disclosed in writing and approved by a majority of disinterested shareholders. There was no written disclosure, no shareholder vote, no meeting minutes, which means the transaction wasn't ratified properly. And that's not just messy, it's voidable. Around noon, Caroline showed up at my hotel unannounced. Her eyes were red. She hadn't slept. "Tell me what you found," she demanded. I stepped aside and let her in. She stood in the middle of the room, rigid. "Thomas said you're making accusations." "I'm reviewing documents." "About Atlantic Harbor?" "Yes." Her face went pale. "He said it was Standard Logistics." "Did you know he owned it?" Silence. That was answer enough. She sat down slowly. "I thought it was just a vendor." "Did you sign the purchase authorization?" "Yes." "Did you disclose the relationship to shareholders?" I didn't know there was one. There it was. She hadn't been architect. She'd been managed, positioned, used as executive signature while her husband captured margin through an intermediary entity. And if auditors followed the money trail, it would lead from Bennett Marine to Atlantic Harbor, and from Atlantic Harbor to Thomas Hayes, which meant the liability triangle looked like this: undeclared electronics, conflict of interest, improper corporate ratification. 3 layers deep. Tier 1 was estate manipulation. Tier 2 was compliance exposure. Tier 3 was financial self-dealing. Caroline looked at me like a child realizing the rules had changed mid-game. "Are we in trouble?" she whispered. That question lingered, and for a moment I saw not the golden child, but a woman who trusted the wrong man. "Potentially," I said evenly. "With Dad too." "Yes." She stood abruptly. "He wouldn't. He already did." Silence filled the room. She shook her head. "He said this restructuring was about protecting us." From what I asked again, this time she didn't defend him. She just stared at the carpet. At 4:55 p.m., my father called both of us into a family meeting scheduled for Sunday evening. Location their home, all immediate family present, which meant Thomas would be there, my mother too. An intervention, or containment. Before I hung up, my father said something deliberate. "This stays inside the family." I responded softly. "Federal auditors don't recognize family boundaries." He didn't reply. After Caroline left my hotel, I opened my laptop and drafted a memo. Not to send, just a document. Timeline. November 14th, hospital admission. November 15th, discharge AMA. Will amendment executed. November 16th, shipment 7,843. L received. November 20th, Caroline added to foundation board. November 22nd, compliance certification signed. December 3rd, second certification signed. December 27th, audit notice received. January 2nd, undeclared electronics discovered. Patterns matter, and this pattern wasn't random. It was layered, carefully, almost cleverly, but not cleverly enough. Let me ask you something. If you were me sitting with this knowledge, would you blow everything open immediately? Call the auditors, expose Thomas, or would you wait for the moment when denial becomes impossible? Because denial is stage 1, blame is stage 2. Victimhood is stage 3. Collapse is stage 4. And we weren't at stage 1 yet. Sunday would begin that process. At 9:11 p.m., another email notification came through. Subject draft shareholder resolution. Urgent signature required. Attached was the retroactive approval form for Caroline's appointment. They were trying to legitimize authority after exposure risk surfaced. Cleanup continues when cracks widen. I didn't sign it. Instead, I forwarded it to my compliance consultant in Savannah. With one line, assess personal exposure if audit escalates. His reply came 15 minutes later. If conflict of interest and undeclared goods are confirmed, civil penalties likely. Potential referral for further investigation. Depends on intent. Intent. That word again. Did Caroline intend deception? Or did she trust too easily? Did my father orchestrate insulation? Or was Thomas exploiting opportunity? Sunday's dinner wasn't about reconciliation. It was about containment. And I had already decided something important. I wasn't going to stop the audit. I wasn't going to warn Thomas. I wasn't going to rescue Caroline. Not yet. Because sometimes the most powerful move is stepping aside and letting the structure collapse under its own weight. What none of them realized yet was that I still held one more leverage point. 15% equity, enough to demand a formal shareholder meeting, and enough to force disclosure on record. At exactly 6:03 p.m. on Sunday, January 7th, I walked into my parents' dining room and counted the chairs. 8. My father, Richard Bennett. My mother, Patricia Bennett. Caroline Bennett Hayes. Thomas Edward Hayes. My younger brother, Michael Bennett, 30 quiet, still finding himself according to Mom. And 3 empty seats for optics. Optics matter in toxic families. If you've ever been summoned to a family dinner that felt more like a boardroom ambush, you already know what was about to happen. The table was set with my mother's silver. Candlelight. Crystal. Roast beef carved perfectly. Control disguised as hospitality. I took my seat without a word. No one mentioned the audit. No one mentioned Atlantic Harbor logistics. No one mentioned the undeclared electronics crate sitting in secured storage. Silence is the first defensive tactic. We ate for exactly 9 minutes before my father set down his fork. "Olivia," he said calmly, "you've been creating unnecessary tension." There it was. Not concern, not clarification. Tension. I dabbed my napkin against my lips. "I've been reviewing compliance exposure." Thomas shifted in his seat. "This is a private business matter," he said. I looked at him directly. "It became a federal matter on December 27th. My mother cut in gently. "We are a family. We don't weaponize technicalities against each other." Technicalities. Undeclared imports. Conflict of interest violations. Improper officer ratification. Apparently those were technicalities now. Let me pause here. If you were sitting in that room knowing a federal audit was scheduled in 11 days and the people responsible were pretending it didn't exist, would you confront them directly or let them keep talking? I let them talk, because denial always exposes more than accusation. Caroline spoke next, her voice thin. Liv, I didn't know about the broker. Thomas's jaw tightened. This is being exaggerated. Is it? I asked evenly. I turned to my father. Did you approve Atlantic Harbor as an intermediary vendor? He hesitated. Yes. Did you disclose that Thomas Hayes owns it? Silence. There it was. Stage 1 denial. We didn't consider it material. My father said carefully. Material. Under corporate governance standards, related party financial gain exceeding trivial amounts is absolutely material. 20 units, $56,000 margin on one shipment. Not material. You signed the will amendment the morning after hospital discharge, I said calmly. You transferred operational authority the day before shipment intake. Then you approved a broker owned by your son-in-law. That sequence isn't accidental. The room froze. My brother Michael looked up sharply. What shipment? He asked. No one answered him. That's how you know something is wrong when information is tiered even inside the family. Thomas leaned forward. You're implying criminal intent. I'm stating documented sequence. You always assume the worst, my father snapped. There it was. The first crack in composure. You taught me to review risk before it explodes, I replied quietly. His hand tightened around his water glass. This company exists because of me, and it survives because of compliance, I said. My mother's voice sharpened slightly. You will not threaten this family with litigation. I haven't, but I could. That truth hovered between us. Then Caroline said something that shifted everything. Dad, did you know the electronics weren't declared? The word electronics echoed. Michael looked confused. Electronics, I thought we imported lumber. No one answered him again. Stage 2 blame. My father turned to Thomas. You handled broker logistics. Thomas's eyes flashed. Based on your instruction. Interesting. The blame triangle had begun forming. My father straightened. I expected proper documentation. And I expected transparent authority, I said calmly. My mother slammed her fork down lightly. Enough. But it wasn't enough. Because truth had already entered the room. And truth doesn't leave quietly. Let's speak plainly, I said. The audit on January 18th will review shipment 7843L. That shipment includes undeclared electronics. Caroline signed intake. Atlantic Harbor profited. Shareholder disclosure was never issued. And executive authority was retroactively drafted. Michael stared at me. Is that true? No one answered. That silence was louder than anything said so far. Then came stage 3. Victimhood. You're trying to destroy us, my mother whispered. There it was. The shift from accountability to emotional accusation. I'm trying to prevent federal escalation, I replied. Thomas stood abruptly. This is harassment. No, I said softly. This is documentation. He pointed at me. You were excluded from the will, and now you want revenge. There it was. Finally. The word hung in the air like smoke. Revenge. Let me ask you something. If your family removed you from inheritance and then accused you of vengeance when you uncovered compliance risk, would you defend yourself emotionally? Or would you let the facts defend you? I chose facts. I haven't contacted auditors, I said evenly. I haven't filed a motion. I haven't reported conflict of interest. All true. I'm giving you time. That sentence shifted the power dynamic completely. Time. I wasn't attacking. I was allowing. An allowance is terrifying when you know exposure exists. Caroline looked at Thomas. You said everything was clean. It is, he snapped. Then why wasn't it declared she pressed? He didn't answer immediately. Stage 4 wasn't collapse yet, but it was close. My father's voice lowered. What do you want, Olivia? There it was. Not anger. Negotiation. I folded my hands on the table. Formal shareholder meeting. Full disclosure of related party transactions. Immediate logging of undeclared inventory. And legal counsel present before the audit. Silence. Michael whispered, This is insane. No. This was inevitable. My father's shoulders sagged slightly. You're overstepping. I still hold 15% equity. He looked at me carefully. You're not trying to fix this. That accusation was almost insightful. I met his eyes. I'm trying to protect myself. And that was the coldest truth in the room. Because here's what none of them understood yet. If auditors determined negligence or intentional misclassification, and if I remained silent despite knowledge, my equity tied me to risk. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was creating separation. The dinner ended without resolution. Thomas left first. Caroline followed him, visibly shaken. My mother avoided eye contact. Michael pulled me aside near the foyer. "What's really going on?" he asked. I looked at him carefully. "There are things Dad didn't tell you." "About what?" "Exposure." He swallowed. "Are we in danger?" "Yes," I said quietly. "Financial danger, legal danger, and something deeper. Family fracture danger." When I stepped outside into the cold night air, my phone buzzed. An email notification. From U.S. Customs and Border Protection. Subject supplemental inquiry. Shipment 7843L. Audit moved up. January 15th. 3 days earlier, someone had triggered escalation, and I hadn't made a single call, which meant one of two things: internal whistle or random selection deepening. Either way, time just shortened, and panic would follow. At 5:47 a.m. on January 8th, my phone rang. No caller ID. When I answered, no one spoke, but I could hear breathing. Then the line disconnected. If you've ever been in the middle of something unraveling, really unraveling, you know that silence can feel louder than threats. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just a compliance issue anymore. It was fear, and fear makes people unpredictable. I made coffee, sat by the hotel window, opened my laptop. No new emails from my father, no messages from Caroline, no defensive texts from Thomas, nothing. After weeks of maneuvering explanations and carefully staged conversations, they had gone completely quiet. That wasn't reconciliation. That was containment mode. Companies do it during investigations. Families do it when they don't know who to trust. At 8:10 a.m., I checked Bennett Marine's internal server again. Several files had been accessed overnight. Audit prep folders, shipping records, vendor certifications. Someone was scrambling. But here's what they didn't understand. Digital timestamps don't erase history. Last-minute edits don't change submission trails. If anything, they create sharper questions. Let me pause here and ask you something. If the people who shut you out suddenly stopped talking entirely, would you push harder, or would you step back and watch what they did next? Because movement under pressure reveals intent. I chose to watch. At 10:32 a.m., my compliance consultant Daniel Reeves called from Savannah, former CBP auditor, 25 years in trade enforcement. The kind of man who speaks slowly because he's already seen every possible mistake. "I reviewed the documents you sent," he said. "And you've got 3 separate problems," he replied. I grabbed a pen. First, misclassified goods tied to a Lacey-Act shipment. That guarantees scrutiny. I wrote it down. Second, related party intermediary without disclosure. Auditors love those. Third, I asked. He paused. Signature authority transition right before the shipment. That raises intent questions. Intent. There was that word again. In your opinion, I asked, who carries the most exposure? He didn't hesitate. The one who signed. Caroline. Even if she didn't understand what she signed, Daniel continued. If your father structured this, investigators will ask why authority shifted when it did. But legally, the certifying officer answers first. That confirmed what I already suspected. Caroline hadn't been empowered. She'd been positioned. And now she was silent. Too silent. Around noon, I drove past her house. Not to confront, just to observe. Her SUV was there. Thomas's truck wasn't. Blinds closed. No movement. I didn't knock. Pressure doesn't need witnesses to build. At 1:14 p.m., my father finally sent a message. Not a call. An email. Subject, we will handle this. Just one line inside. Do not involve outside parties. I read it twice. Then once more. Do not involve outside parties. That wasn't a request. It was an attempt at control. But control had already shifted the moment federal auditors moved the date. You don't get to privately handle a federal examination. That's not how regulatory law works. I didn't reply, because engagement would signal negotiation, and this wasn't negotiable anymore. At 3:40 p.m., something unexpected happened. My brother Michael called. Well, if he said voice low, I went to the office. And Dad's meeting with lawyers. That was fast. Corporate counsel, I asked. No, he said. Someone else. White-collar defense. I closed my eyes briefly. Defense attorneys don't get hired for paperwork cleanups. They get hired when someone believes liability might escalate. Michael sounded shaken. What aren't they telling me? That this isn't just about the will, I said. They said you were overreacting. That's easier than explaining risk. He was quiet for a long moment. Are they in real trouble? I answered honestly. They could be. And Caroline. That question lingered longer. She's the one auditors will start with, I said. He exhaled sharply. That's not fair. No, I agreed. It isn't. Fairness has nothing to do with enforcement structures. Responsibility follows signatures. At 6:05 p.m., I received a calendar notification forwarded accidentally or intentionally. Internal meeting, January 12th. Subject, pre-audit strategy session. Location, Bennett Marine Conference Room. They hadn't invited me, which was a mistake. Because under the bylaws, any shareholder can demand access to material risk discussions. Exclusion now created another governance violation, but I didn't assert that right. Not yet. Because something else was happening beneath the surface. The silence. The legal consultations. The sudden strategy meetings. They were preparing for January 15th like it was a storm. And storms reveal structures that were never built to withstand pressure. That night, I sat at my desk reviewing one more document Daniel had flagged earlier. Insurance. Specifically, Bennett Marine's Directors and Officers Liability Policy. D&O coverage protects executives from personal exposure unless fraud, intentional misconduct, or undisclosed conflicts are involved. I scanned the exclusions clause again, and there it was. Coverage void in cases of material non-disclosure involving related party financial gain. Atlantic Harbor. Thomas. Undisclosed margin. If auditors classified that as material non-disclosure, insurance wouldn't shield anyone. Not my father. Not Thomas. Not even Caroline. Which meant the financial consequences could become personal. Homes. Savings. Assets. Everything. That was the first moment I felt something shift inside me. Not anger. Not satisfaction. Something heavier. Because revenge imagines spectacle. But reality often looks like slow collapse. Let me ask you one more thing. If you saw the people who hurt you walking straight toward consequences, they built themselves. Would you stop them or let them learn? I didn't know the answer yet. But I knew this. I wasn't going to interfere. January 15th was coming. And with it, questions no one could avoid. At 11:22 p.m., another email arrived. From Caroline. Just 3 words. Did you know? No accusation. No explanation. Just that question. I stared at the screen for a long time, because now the silence wasn't strategic anymore. It was cracking. And once cracks begin, they spread fast. Next chapter begins the preparation no one else could see. Because while they were lawyering up, I was getting ready for the one place truth can't be managed. The audit table. At 6:30 a.m. on January 9th, I stopped reacting and started preparing. That was the morning revenge stopped being personal and became procedural. If you've ever realized that the most powerful move isn't confrontation, it's documentation, you'll understand why I didn't answer Caroline's message right away. Instead, I opened a new folder on my laptop. Name separation file. Not attack. Not accusation. Separation. Because when legal exposure enters a situation, the first priority is creating distance between what you know and what you're responsible for. Inside that folder, I began building a timeline. Not emotional. Not interpretive. Just facts. November 14th. Richard Bennett hospitalized. November 15th. Will amended following discharge AMA. November 16th. Shipment 7,843. L received with undeclared electronics. November 20th. Caroline added to Foundation leadership. November 22nd. Compliance certification signed. December 27th. Federal audit notice issued. January 2nd. Inventory discrepancy discovered. January 15th. Accelerated audit date scheduled. Every entry supported by documentation. Auditors don't care about family drama. They care about sequence. And sequence was now my strongest ally. At 8:12 a.m., I finally replied to Caroline. Come meet me. Alone. We chose a neutral place, a public park along the Ashley River. No offices. No houses. No witnesses tied to the business. Just 2 sisters on a bench that smelled faintly of salt water and winter grass. Caroline looked exhausted. Not defensive. Not polished. Just tired. I didn't know about Atlantic Harbor, she said immediately. I believe you. That surprised her. You do? Yes, I said. But belief doesn't change signatures. She stared at the water. I thought Dad was transitioning things slowly. He said you didn't want involvement anymore. That's not what the bylaws say. She rubbed her temples. Thomas handled the logistics. Dad handled the structure. I thought I was just learning. Learning. That word carried a kind of quiet tragedy now. Let me pause here. If someone you loved had been used not maliciously but carelessly, would you still want payback? Or would you want clarity? I wasn't sure which I wanted yet, so I stayed focused on facts. The audit will ask you specific questions, I said. What kind of questions? Who verified shipment contents? Who approved vendor selection? Whether any financial relationships existed between Bennett Marine and Atlantic Harbor. She went still. What happens if I didn't know the answers? They'll ask why you signed anyway. That's the part people misunderstand about compliance law. Intent matters, but responsibility attaches to action. Caroline whispered Thomas said it was standard structuring. Standard structuring requires disclosure. She looked at me. Why didn't you report this already? There it was. The question everyone assumes has a dramatic answer. I shook my head slightly. Because this isn't about punishment. Then what is it about? Boundaries. That word settled between us. For the first time since December 23rd, we weren't adversaries. We were two people standing in the aftermath of decisions neither of us fully controlled. I need you to do something, I said. What? Tell the truth what they ask. Don't defend anyone. Don't speculate. Just answer what you know. She swallowed. And Dad, I'm not managing Dad's choices. And Thomas, that's between you and him. The wind picked up off the river. Caroline hugged her coat tighter. I feel like everything's collapsing, she said. I didn't correct her. Because sometimes collapse is just reality catching up. At 11:05 a.m., I met again with Daniel Reeves over video call. I'm not representing them, I clarified. I'm documenting separation. He nodded. Smart. Make sure your knowledge trail shows you raised concerns but didn't participate in concealment. We reviewed language carefully. Not accusatory. Not protective. Neutral. Neutral is powerful, especially when everyone else is scrambling emotionally. By mid-afternoon, I drafted a formal notice to Bennett Marine's counsel. Not a threat. A record. It stated that as a minority shareholder, I had identified potential compliance irregularities and would not participate in operational decision-making pending audit review. No accusations. No demands. Just distance. That single document did something enormous. It drew a line, and lines change liability. Around 4:20 p.m., my father finally called. His voice sounded older. You're isolating yourself from the company. I'm clarifying my position. You think this protects you? It clarifies responsibility. Silence. Then quietly, you're still my daughter. This wasn't reconciliation. It was confusion, because he still thought this was about family roles. It wasn't. It was about consequences. You made business decisions, I said gently. So did I. He didn't argue. That scared me more than anger would have, because anger means control. Acceptance means he was running out of it. That night, I reviewed one final piece of information Daniel had uncovered. Customs had already requested supplemental valuation documents directly from Atlantic Harbor Logistics, not Bennett Marine, Atlantic Harbor, which meant investigators had already followed the transaction chain. Thomas wasn't anticipating scrutiny anymore. He was in it, and he didn't control that process. No one did. January 15th wasn't going to be dramatic. No courtroom. No speeches, just a conference table. Documents. Questions, Truth asked quietly. But those moments are where lives actually change. Not with shouting, with signatures. Before I shut down my laptop, I wrote one sentence in the separation file. Justice is rarely loud, it's administrative. And for the first time since this began, I slept. Because preparation was finished. There was nothing left to uncover, only what others would choose to say. Next chapter begins the final hours before the audit, and the decision someone made, that none of us expected. At 4:58 p.m. on January 14th, the day before the audit, it finally happened. Someone tried to fix everything, and made it worse. I was sitting at a small desk in my hotel room, reviewing my notes, when an email notification appeared from Bennett Marine's internal system. Subject revised inventory declaration. Urgent submission. Attached was a newly created intake report for shipment 7843L, timestamped that afternoon, listing the electronics, backdated to November 16th. I stared at it for a long moment, because this wasn't clarification. This was alteration. An alteration after notice of audit isn't correction. It's discoverable, which means auditors don't see it as cooperation. They see it as consciousness of guilt. I picked up my phone and called Caroline immediately. Did you authorize a revised inventory filing today, I asked? Her voice sounded panicked. No, Dad said the lawyers recommended updating records. After the audit notice. Yes, is that wrong? I closed my eyes briefly. Yes, I said. It's very wrong. There was a long silence. I didn't sign anything, she whispered. Who did? I think Dad did. With Martin. That meant Richard Bennett had personally inserted himself back into documentation, trying to clean the record. But federal reviews rely on original timestamps, electronic logs, and prior submissions. You can add information. You cannot rewrite sequence. And attempting to do so raises a different kind of question. Intent to mislead. Let me ask you something. If you watched someone dig deeper because they couldn't admit a mistake, would you intervene? Or would you step aside before you got pulled in, too? I chose distance. Immediately, I documented the new filing's metadata and sent it to Daniel Reeves. His reply came 9 minutes later. This needs to stop. If more revisions appear now, it creates exposure narrative. Do not engage operationally. I wasn't planning to. But someone else still believed this could be handled. At 6:22 p.m., my father called. I've corrected the inventory oversight, he said. By creating a retroactive record, it reflects reality. It reflects panic. Silence. You don't understand how regulators work, he said. I let that sit for a moment. I understand exactly how they work, I replied. They compare first statements to later ones. We are allowed to amend internal records. Yes, I said calmly, but not history. His breathing grew heavier. I built this company from nothing. And you're trying to protect it, I said. Yes, there it was again. Protection. But protection without transparency becomes obstruction faster than people expect. He lowered his voice. You think I'd risk everything intentionally? I didn't answer right away, because that wasn't the real question. The real question was, did he think he could outmaneuver a process designed specifically to prevent maneuvering? I think you're afraid, I said quietly. He didn't deny it. That was the first honest moment we'd had in weeks. At 7:50 p.m., Caroline texted me. Thomas still says this will blow over, I replied. It won't. No anger, no explanation, just truth. Because the moment auditors begin asking about transaction flow, optimism stops being relevant. Documentation answers. At 9:05 p.m., Michael called again. I think Mom's in denial, he said. She keeps saying families get through things like this. They do, I said. Just not always in the same shape. He was quiet. Are you going tomorrow? Yes. On whose side? That question lingered longer than anything else he'd asked. 'Cause people always want this to be about sides. I'm going as a shareholder, I said. Not daughter, not opponent, not ally. Just a person with legal standing. That distinction mattered. Before midnight, I reviewed my separation file one last time. Every email, every timestamp, every conversation summary. No accusations. Only chronology. Chronology is powerful because it doesn't argue. It simply shows. And what it showed was this: a rapid restructuring, an undisclosed relationship, a misclassified shipment, a panicked attempt to reconcile records. None of it loud, all of it cumulative. At 11:42 p.m., another message came in from Caroline. 3 sentences this time. I trusted them. I trusted Thomas. I don't know what tomorrow looks like. I read it twice before answering. Tomorrow looks like questions. Just answer them. 'Cause that's all audits really are. Structured questions. But answers change lives. I slept for exactly 4 hours. At 5:30 a.m. on January 15th, I got dressed in a charcoal suit, the same one I wear to regulatory hearings. Not to intimidate, to remind myself what this was. Process, not revenge. By 7:10 a.m., I was walking toward Bennett Marine's conference room. Through glass walls, I could already see them. My father at the head of the table. Caroline beside him. Thomas across from her. 2 CBP officers setting up laptops. Folders stacked neatly. No raised voices. No drama. Just quiet professionalism. This was the moment everything shifted from private tension to official record. And once something enters the record, it doesn't disappear. Chapter 10 begins at that table, where denial becomes explanation, and explanation becomes consequence. Tiep Chuang 10, Chapter 10, the table. At 7:32 a.m. on January 15th, I took my seat at the far end of the conference table as the lead Customs and Border Protection Officer introduced herself. Supervisory Import Specialist Dana Whitaker, she said, sliding a folder open with precise efficiency. No one spoke. No one needed to. Because this wasn't a confrontation. It was a review. If you've never seen how these examinations begin, they don't start with accusations. They start with very simple questions. And simple questions are often the hardest to answer. Officer Whitaker looked around the table. Before we begin, please state your roles for the record. My father straightened. Richard Bennett, founder and president. Caroline followed her voice tight. Caroline Bennett Hayes, vice president of operations. Thomas cleared his throat. Thomas Hayes, external logistics consultant. That description was new. External consultant, not owner of Atlantic Harbor. Interesting choice. When it came to me, I answered plainly. Olivia Bennett, minority shareholder, non-operational. Whitaker nodded and began typing. The second officer, Mark Delaney, connected his laptop to a projector. A shipment summary appeared on the screen. Shipment ID 7843L. Declared contents treated teak lumber. Then he asked the first real question. Who certified intake verification for this shipment? Caroline raised her hand slightly. I did. Her voice didn't shake, but her fingers tightened around her pen. Stage 1 had begun, establishing responsibility. Whitaker nodded. Walk us through your verification process. Caroline swallowed. I relied on documentation prepared by our vendor and broker. Did you physically inspect the shipment? Pause. No. Did anyone under your supervision? I believed it had been handled. Believed. That word hung in the air. Whitaker made a note. Then Delaney switched slides. Images of the electronics crate appeared. Photographs I recognized. The ones taken during secured storage review. We identified undeclared merchandise within the shipment, he said calmly. Can you explain why these items were not listed on the entry summary? Silence filled the room. My father leaned forward. That was an administrative oversight. Stage 2. Blame the process. Whitaker looked at him directly. Mr. Bennett, were you involved in shipment preparation? Yes. Then why did Miss Hayes certify compliance? He hesitated. We were transitioning responsibilities. On November 16th, yes. Whitaker typed again. Her expression didn't change, but her questions became narrower. And Atlantic Harbor Logistics served as intermediary broker. Thomas answered quickly. Yes, they facilitated sourcing. Do you hold a financial interest in Atlantic Harbor? That was the first moment the room truly froze. Thomas shifted. It's a separate entity. Whitaker didn't blink. That was not my question. A long pause. Then, yes. There it was. Disclosure. But late. Very late. Let me stop for a second. If you were sitting there watching the truth come out piece by piece, would you feel satisfaction or just the weight of inevitability? Because there was no triumph in that room, only consequence unfolding exactly as procedure demands. Whitaker continued. Was this relationship disclosed to Bennett Marine shareholders prior to transaction approval? No one answered. So she asked again. Was it disclosed? My father finally spoke. No. Stage 3. Recognition. Delaney clicked to another slide financial flowcharts, tracing payments from Bennett Marine to Atlantic Harbor, then outward to the overseas supplier. Clean, traceable, unavoidable. Mr. Hayes Delaney said Atlantic Harbor realized margin on this transaction. Was that margin reported to Bennett Marine's board for approval? Thomas's voice had lost its earlier confidence. No. Whitaker closed the folder in front of her, not loudly, just decisively. Thank you, she said. We'll be requesting additional documentation regarding classification decisions, related party disclosures, and internal controls. Not accusations. Requests. But requests backed by authority. Caroline finally spoke. I didn't know about the ownership connection. Whitaker looked at her. Intent and knowledge are part of our review. We'll need written clarification. Caroline nodded slowly. My father leaned back in his chair, the first visible sign of strain crossing his face. This was stage 4. Not collapse. Realization. Because he understood now. This wasn't a family issue. It wasn't negotiable. It wasn't fixable through relationships. It was procedural. And procedure doesn't respond to emotion. The meeting ended at 9:06 a.m. No raised voices. No dramatic exits. Just a list of follow-up requests and a 14-day deadline for submission. As the officers packed their materials, Whitaker said one final sentence. Our goal is accurate compliance. Cooperation matters. Not punishment. Not yet. Just accountability. After they left, no one spoke for nearly a minute. Then Thomas muttered, We can still manage this. My father didn't respond. Caroline stared at the table. Michael, who had been asked to observe but say nothing, looked like he'd aged 5 years in an hour. And me, I gathered my notebook, because my part was finished. I hadn't accused, hadn't defended, hadn't intervened. I had simply been present. As I stood to leave, my father said quietly, You really were protecting yourself. I met his eyes. Yes. He nodded once. Not angry, not proud, just tired. You always were the careful one, he said. That wasn't praise. It was acknowledgement. And acknowledgement is what comes after resistance ends. But consequences don't arrive all at once. They unfold. In letters, in findings, in required corrections, in financial adjustments. The real outcome wouldn't be decided in that room. It would come later, through paperwork, through determinations, through slow-moving karma disguised as administration. And one more thing was still unresolved. Caroline hadn't decided what she was going to do about Thomas. That conversation hadn't happened yet. Next chapter begins with the findings letter, and the choice that finally broke the illusion of unity. At 2:16 p.m. on February 2nd, the findings letter arrived. Not by email, by certified mail. Thick envelope, government seal, signature required. That's how you know something has moved from inquiry to conclusion. If you've ever held one of those envelopes, you know the strange quiet that comes with it. No drama, just wait. My father called everyone to the house again. Same dining room, same polished table. But nothing felt staged this time. No candles, no silver, just documents. We sat down without small talk. Caroline hadn't spoken much to anyone in the last 2 weeks. Thomas looked irritated more than worried. My mother clung to the idea that this was all still a misunderstanding. My father opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a formal determination from Customs and Border Protection. Findings: failure to declare imported merchandise properly, deficient internal compliance controls, undisclosed related party transaction, negligent violation classification. Negligent, not fraudulent. That word mattered. Negligence carries penalties. Fraud carries prosecutions. My father exhaled almost imperceptibly. Civil penalty assessed $312,000. Mandatory compliance restructuring. Independent monitoring period 18 months. Payable by the company, not individuals. But then came the second document. Supplemental Governance Advisory. This one wasn't about customs. It addressed corporate conduct. It required formal disclosure of Atlantic Harbor logistics and immediate termination or restructuring of related party dealings, unless independently approved. In plain language, Thomas could no longer sit in the middle of transactions. The structure he built had to be dismantled. Silence filled the room. Thomas spoke first. "This is overreach." "No," I said quietly. "It's standard remedy." He looked at Caroline. "Tell them this is manageable." Caroline didn't answer. She was reading the last page. Her name appeared several times. Not accused, not blamed, but identified as the certifying officer responsible for corrective implementation going forward. Responsibility stayed with her, because titles don't disappear when things go wrong. Let me pause here. If you were Caroline realizing you'd been placed in the line of accountability while someone else profited quietly, what would you do next? Defend your husband, or defend yourself? She set the papers down carefully. "Thomas," she said, voice steady, "why didn't you tell me you owned Atlantic Harbor?" It wasn't relevant. It became relevant when I signed federal certifications. He scoffed. "You're overreacting. The penalty's against the company, not us." She looked at him in a way I hadn't seen before. Not confused. Clear. "You let me take responsibility for something you structured. That's business," he replied. "No," she said quietly. "That's concealment." My mother tried to interrupt. "We are not turning on each other." Caroline raised her hand. "Mom, please." That was the moment the illusion finally broke. Not because of the audit. Not because of the penalty. Because someone refused to pretend anymore. She turned back to Thomas. "I asked you directly if there were conflicts." "You trusted me," he said. "Yes," she replied. "And you used that." Silence again. But this silence was different from the one in Chapter 7. This wasn't fear. It was separation forming in real time. My father leaned forward. "We'll restructure. We'll comply. We'll move on." Caroline shook her head slightly. "No, I will." That distinction mattered. Not we. She stood. "I'm stepping down from any transaction involving Atlantic Harbor, effective immediately. And I want independent counsel reviewing everything I signed." Thomas stared at her. "You're letting them push you around." She met his gaze. "No, I'm deciding where I stand." That was the collapse. Not loud, not explosive. Just a decision no one else could control. My brother Michael whispered, "So what happens now?" No one answered immediately, because the truth was simple. Now we live with it. The company would pay the penalty. Processes would change. Oversight would increase. And the family, it would never return to what it was before December 23rd. Not broken, just honest. As the meeting ended, my father stopped me near the doorway. "You didn't fight us," he said. "No, you just waited." "Yes." He nodded slowly. That was harder to face. I didn't respond, because revenge isn't always about striking back. Sometimes it's about refusing to carry what was handed to you and letting others confront what they built. Caroline walked out separately. Thomas left alone. My mother sat at the table longer than anyone else, staring at the paperwork like it spoke a language she never wanted to learn. Consequences don't shout. They stay. Quietly. Not about punishment. About what happens after the tables turn. At 6:08 a.m. on March 1st, I stood on the Charleston Battery, watching the tide come in. No phone calls. No legal updates. No meetings. Just water moving the way it always has. That was the first morning in months nothing demanded my attention. If you expected a dramatic ending, someone losing everything, shouting matches, doors slamming, that's not how this story ends. Real consequences don't look like explosions. They look like adjustments. Bennett Marine paid the penalty within 30 days. An independent compliance firm moved into the office. Every contract now required dual verification. Every import went through documented inspection. Slow, methodical, expensive, but stable. The company didn't collapse. It changed. And that change cost more than money. Thomas resigned from all involvement 2 weeks after the findings letter. Atlantic Harbor Logistics dissolved quietly not long after. No lawsuits, no public scandal. Just paperwork filed and a business structure erased. Caroline stayed. Not because it was easy. Because walking away would have meant never reclaiming her own authority. We met once for coffee in mid-February. Neutral ground again. No lawyers. No tension. I used to think being trusted meant not asking questions, she said. I nodded. Now I read everything. That was growth, not redemption. Growth is quieter than that. She didn't apologize. I didn't ask her to. Some things don't need apologies. They need acknowledgement. Our relationship isn't what it was, but it's real now. No roles, no golden child, no outsider. Just two adults who learned the same lesson from different angles. My father officially retired at the end of February. Earlier than planned. Not forced. Just finished. We had dinner alone before I went back to Atlanta. No agenda. No strategy. At one point, he said I thought I was holding the family together. I answered honestly. You were holding this structure together. He gave a small smile. Turns out that's not the same thing. No anger remained between us. But something more important replaced it. Boundaries. And boundaries are healthier than loyalty ever was. Let me ask you one last question. If the people who hurt you never fully admit they were wrong, but they change their behavior, is that enough? For me, it is. Because revenge was never the goal. Clarity was. And clarity lasts longer. I moved my legal practice out of corporate defense work this spring. I now consult on compliance design, helping companies avoid exactly the kind of situation Bennett Marine walked into. There's irony in that, but also peace. You didn't destroy us, my father told me during our last call. No, I said. I just stepped out of the way. That's the thing no one tells you about karma. It doesn't arrive like punishment. It arrives like process. Slow, documented, unavoidable. And when the tables turn, they don't slam. They settle. These days my mornings are quieter. I read contracts. I walk by the water when I can. I answer the phone when Caroline calls, sometimes about work, sometimes about nothing at all. We're rebuilding something, not the old version of family. A better one. Defined. Honest. Chosen. If this story felt familiar, if you've ever dealt with betrayal inheritance conflict or a toxic family dynamic that forced you to redraw your own boundaries, share your thoughts. I read more of those messages than you'd think. And if you want to hear what happened in another case that taught me just as much about trust and consequences, stay subscribed. Because some lessons only make sense after everything changes.